The jury reached a verdict in this case.
Guilty.
Three matching suitcases turn up, days apart, floating in and around a bay hundreds of miles from home. Inside them, pieced apart, is a man who was supposed to be at work in New Jersey. His wife told everyone he'd walked out on their marriage and their two young sons. What she didn't mention was the affair with her boss, the gun she'd bought 2 days before he vanished, or the sedative found in his own abandoned car. Hit subscribe if you want more cases like this one broken down properly. Drop a like while you're here, it genuinely helps the video reach more people. And in the comments, tell me your city or your country. I'm building a list right now to start covering cases near where people actually live. Let's get into what happened to Bill McGuire and the wife who's still, to this day, insisting she didn't do it. In 2004, 3 dark green Kenneth Cole suitcases surfaced in and around the Chesapeake Bay, not far from Virginia Beach. Inside them was a dismembered body. It took investigators time to identify him, but eventually the pieces led back to Bill McGuire, 39 years old, an employee at the New Jersey Institute of Technology who actually lived over 300 miles away in Woodbridge, New Jersey. The medical examiner determined he'd been shot more than once before his body was cut apart and packed into that luggage. His wife, Melanie McGuire, worked as a fertility nurse and was raising their 2 young sons. She would eventually be convicted of killing him and disposing of his remains, and she was sentenced to life in prison. More than a decade later, she's an inmate at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in Clinton, New Jersey, still maintaining that she's innocent and still insisting that whoever actually killed her husband has never been caught. Let's start with the affair, because it's genuinely where the entire prosecution case begins. Melanie was involved with a doctor named Bradley Miller, a partner at the fertility practice where she worked, RMA Associates. She never denied the relationship. What she did dispute was the story prosecutors told about what that relationship meant for her marriage. Melanie's own account of the morning Bill disappeared, April 29, 2004, paints their relationship as already violent. She says the two of them got into a serious physical altercation that morning, that he choked her with a dryer sheet and hit her hard enough, in her words, that a closed fist would have broken her cheekbone. She says she grabbed their 2-year-old and locked herself in the bathroom to get away from him, and that Bill told her he was leaving for good, that she could tell their kids they no longer had a father. According to her, that was the last time she ever saw him. Investigators, working the case first out of Virginia and then handing it over to New Jersey authorities, wanted to know one specific thing early on. Had Melanie ever legally owned a firearm? A search of New Jersey's gun records came back empty. But when they widened the search to Pennsylvania, a state notably close to the New Jersey border with comparatively relaxed gun laws and shorter waiting periods, they found exactly what they were looking for. Melanie McGuire had purchased a handgun there. Melanie's explanation was that Bill had asked her to buy it on his behalf, since a prior felony conviction tied to a bad driving record legally barred him from purchasing a firearm himself. What made investigators sit up, though, wasn't just the purchase itself. It was the timing. That gun was bought only 2 days before Bill went missing. Once Melanie became the primary suspect, investigators obtained wiretaps on her phone lines, recording conversations with friends, family, and Dr. Miller. When they eventually approached Miller directly about the affair, he denied any involvement in the crime and agreed to wear a wire to help clear his name. He was never charged, and he ultimately testified against Melanie at trial. Prosecutor Patty Prezioso, who led the case, later said investigators looked closely at Miller and simply never found anything connecting him to the murder itself. The next major thread in the investigation involved Bill's missing car. After his remains were identified and Melanie was informed of his death, she suggested investigators check Atlantic City, telling them Bill had a gambling problem and often spent time there. Police found the vehicle in a parking lot in Atlantic City almost immediately. That parking lot happened to have surveillance cameras, and both investigators and local media initially believed that footage might reveal exactly who had driven the car there. What Melanie told Dr. Miller about that car, once she learned surveillance footage existed, is one of the stranger details in this entire case. She described getting increasingly angry the night after Bill disappeared, suspecting he'd gone to Atlantic City, and deciding, in what she called a genuinely irrational impulse, to drive down there herself looking for his car. She claimed she actually spotted his sedan from the highway on her first pass through the area and decided to move it into a different parking spot, something she said the two of them had done to mess with each other in the past whenever they were angry. It's an account she's acknowledged sounds close to unbelievable on its face, though she maintains it's exactly what happened. The surveillance footage itself turned out to be a disappointment for investigators. It showed the car being pulled into its spot, but the image quality wasn't clear enough to identify who was actually behind the wheel. Prosecutor Prezioso came to believe Melanie had planted the car there deliberately, to create the impression that Bill was still alive and simply missing rather than dead, and she's pointed out that pulling off that particular maneuver, moving one car from one location to another, would have required a second driver, and by extension, a second person's involvement. Investigators have always suspected an accomplice existed somewhere in this case. Nobody besides Melanie has ever been charged. While the surveillance footage came up short, a different piece of evidence turned out to be far more damaging. Melanie's electronic toll payment statement showed 2 charges, adding up to 90 cents, that confirmed she'd actually driven down to Atlantic City after Bill went missing. She then called the toll company and tried to have those specific charges removed from her account. She's since said that decision came from panic, that she was afraid exactly what people would eventually think once those toll records surfaced, and moved to erase them before anyone could draw that conclusion. Investigators processing Bill's abandoned car turned up something else entirely, a bottle of the sedative chloral hydrate along with 2 syringes. Tracing the purchase, they discovered it had been picked up at a pharmacy near the daycare the Maguire children attended on the very morning Bill disappeared. The prescription had been written on a pad belonging to Dr. Miller. When Miller was shown it, he said outright that the signature wasn't his, and that the handwriting looked like Melanie's instead. Prosecutors concluded she'd forged the prescription herself, using her access to Miller's pad through her job at the clinic. 5 days after Bill vanished, Melanie made another trip, this time telling Miller she was going furniture shopping in Delaware. Prosecutor Prezioso believes this was actually the trip where Melanie transported the suitcases containing Bill's remains down to the Chesapeake Bay, since driving from New Jersey to Virginia Beach naturally routes through Delaware. The first suitcase turned up the following day. Melanie has firmly disputed this version of events, pointing out that the distance between Delaware and Virginia Beach spans hundreds of miles, and arguing there simply wasn't enough driving time within that trip to account for both errands. Despite all of this circumstantial groundwork, investigators struggled for a long stretch to find direct physical evidence tying Melanie to the actual killing. They searched the family home repeatedly, applying luminol, pulling up floorboards, even removing sections of piping, trying to determine whether Bill had been shot and dismembered inside the house itself. They came up with nothing. No blood, no forensic trace suggesting that home had ever been a crime scene. What they did eventually find came from Bill's car instead, small fragments of human tissue that investigators and the media both came to refer to as human sawdust. The theory prosecutors built around this detail was that Melanie, despite being meticulous by nature and profession, had inadvertently tracked tiny particles of her husband's remains from wherever the dismemberment actually took place, on the soles of her own shoes, into the vehicle. Melanie Maguire was arrested on June 5, 2005, and charged with first-degree murder. She pleaded not guilty. Her defense leaned heavily into the absence of hard physical evidence, arguing it was far more plausible that Bill had been killed because of his gambling habits than at the hands of his wife. The trial ran for close to 6 weeks and ended in a guilty verdict. On July 19, 2007, Melanie McGuire was sentenced to life in prison. By the time the trial actually reached a jury, the case had already become a major media story, covered on national television as it unfolded, with the suitcases and the dismemberment giving it exactly the kind of grim, cinematic detail that draws sustained press attention. Prosecutor Prezioso described the overall picture she presented to jurors as evidence of a carefully organized, deliberately executed killing rather than anything spontaneous. The defense countered that a case built almost entirely on timelines, phone records, and inference, without a confirmed crime scene, without a murder weapon definitively recovered from Melanie's possession, and without an eyewitness of any kind, left too much room for reasonable doubt. The jury didn't agree and reached its guilty verdict after weighing everything laid out over that 6-week span. It's worth pausing on what happened to the rest of the family once the trial concluded. Bill and Melanie's 2 sons, one of them still a toddler at the time their father disappeared, ended up in the custody of Bill's sister, Cindy Ligosh, rather than remaining with either parent. That's its own kind of quiet tragedy sitting underneath the headlines about suitcases and ballistics. 2 children who lost their father to a homicide, and then lost their mother to a life sentence within the same few years, raised afterward by an aunt who'd also just lost her own brother to the same case. That would normally be where a story like this ends, but Melanie's case has taken on a second life in recent years. A podcast called Direct Appeal, hosted by 2 criminology professors from Fairleigh Dickinson University, Megan Sachs and Amy Schlossberg, revisited the evidence years after her conviction and came away believing she may have been wrongfully convicted. Their central argument is that several pieces of evidence presented at trial deserved closer scrutiny than they actually received. One of the most specific disputes involves the murder weapon itself. Melanie and the podcast hosts point to a mismatch between the rifling pattern found on the bullets recovered from Bill's body and the rifling specifications listed by the manufacturer for the exact gun Melanie purchased in Pennsylvania. A detail involving the number of lands and grooves, the machined ridges pressed into a gun barrel that leave a matching imprint on any bullet fired through it. According to Melanie, the bullets from her husband's body showed 6 of these marks, while the manufacturer's own website listed her specific gun model as producing 5. Prosecutor Prezioso has firmly rejected this argument, calling it an error on the manufacturer's website rather than a genuine forensic discrepancy, and pointing out that the actual courtroom evidence came from trained ballistics experts, not from a company's product page. The podcast and Melanie also raise questions about the internet search history prosecutors presented at trial, which reportedly included searches for how to purchase guns illegally, how to commit murder, undetectable poisons, and general methods for sedating or killing someone. Melanie has pushed back on this evidence specifically because of her own professional background, arguing that as a nurse, she had access to a physician's reference guide sitting on her shelf, something that would have told her anything she needed to know without ever leaving a digital trail behind. Her defense team argued more broadly that the searches couldn't be conclusively tied to her specifically, since other people had access to the same devices. There are 2 more disputed threads worth mentioning. Investigators found trash bags inside the McGuire home that they believed matched the ones used to wrap portions of Bill's remains. The podcast hosts argue the state's plastic analysis wasn't thorough enough to make that connection definitively, essentially suggesting the bags functioned more as a persuasive visual for the jury than as hard scientific proof. The state's own expert disagreed, maintaining he'd run the tests he considered sufficient. And then there's the matter of unidentified animal hair found on Bill's remains, hair that investigators were never able to trace back to any pet connected to Melanie in any way, a loose end that's never been fully explained by either side. Prosecutor Prezioso, for her part, remains completely convinced the right person was convicted and has said plainly that her responsibility was never to convince the broader public. Only the jury that actually heard the case. Melanie McGuire, now well past a decade into her sentence and not eligible for parole until she turns 101 years old, has exhausted her formal appeals. Custody of her two sons went to Bill's sister, Cindy Ligosh, and Melanie has had no contact with either of them since her trial concluded. Her message to them, now that they're adults themselves, has simply been to keep questioning what they've been told, to look past the surface version of events, and to go digging through the documentation that still exists. Now let's break down what actually made this case work for prosecutors, and separately, what continues to make it a genuine subject of dispute among people who have re-examined it since. The first technical thread is how much of this case rested on circumstantial and behavioral evidence, rather than a single, decisive piece of physical proof. Investigators searched the McGuire home multiple times using luminol and structural teardown, and came away with nothing that established it as the actual crime scene. That absence is unusual in a domestic homicide involving dismemberment, since a task that physically demanding typically leaves behind detectable traces somewhere. Instead, the case leaned on a sequence of behavioral red flags stacked one on top of another. A gun purchase timed suspiciously close to the disappearance, toll records showing an unexplained trip followed by an attempt to erase them, a forged prescription for a sedative picked up near the family's daycare, and a car deliberately relocated in a way that required a second person's help. Individually, none of these facts prove murder. Together, they formed the timeline prosecutors used to build their case. The second thread is the ballistics dispute itself, which is a genuinely useful example of how forensic arguments can get complicated once they leave a courtroom and move into public re-examination. A manufacturer's published specifications for a firearm and the actual forensic analysis performed on recovered bullets aren't always sourced from. The same kind of documentation and discrepancies between a general product listing and a specific ballistics report can happen for reasons that have nothing to do with the gun's actual history, manufacturing variations, database errors, or simple clerical mistakes on a company website. Whether that particular gap in this case reflects an actual mismatch or a documentation error remains a point of real disagreement between the original prosecution and the people who have since revisited the evidence. The third thread is what the trace evidence, the human tissue found in the car, was actually able to prove versus what it merely suggested. Finding those particles in the vehicle established a connection between that car and Bill's remains. It didn't, on its own, establish exactly where the dismemberment occurred or who performed it. Prosecutors built a specific narrative around how those particles ended up there, tracked in on footwear, that filled a gap the physical evidence alone couldn't close. That's a common pattern in circumstantial cases. Physical evidence establishes a connection, and narrative reasoning is used to explain the mechanism behind that connection in a way jurors can follow. The fourth thread is the unresolved animal hair and the disputed trash bag analysis, both of which remain genuinely open questions even now. Evidence that can't be conclusively traced to a defendant doesn't automatically clear them, but it also doesn't strengthen the case against them, and both of these details sit in that uncertain middle ground, present in the investigative record, never fully explained, and still cited by people on both sides of the ongoing debate over this conviction. As for the psychological picture behind this case, what stands out most is the deliberate, methodical quality prosecutors attributed to nearly every step. A gun purchased just before the disappearance, a sedative obtained through a forged prescription, a car relocated with outside help, toll records targeted for deletion after the fact. If the prosecution's version is accurate, this wasn't a moment of sudden rage. It was a sustained, multi-step operation requiring planning across several days, and very likely, cooperation from at least one other person. At the same time, Melanie's own account complicates that picture in a way worth sitting with honestly. She's described a marriage that had already turned physically violent by the morning Bill disappeared, an account that, if true, reframes everything that follows in a very different light, less a calculated elimination for the sake of a new relationship, and more the aftermath of an abusive situation she says she was actively trying to escape. The court ultimately didn't find her account credible enough to outweigh the prosecution's case. Nearly 2 decades later, with a podcast, 2 academics, and Melanie herself still actively pushing back on specific pieces of that evidence, this remains one of the rarer true crime cases where the ending genuinely isn't settled for everyone who's looked closely at it, even though the legal system reached its own final answer back in 2007. What makes this particular case linger longer than most isn't just the suitcases, or the affair, or even the ballistics argument that's still being debated years after sentencing. It's the specific combination of a nationally televised trial that felt, at the time, like an open and shut circumstantial case, sitting alongside a body of evidence that, on closer inspection years later, turns out to contain more genuine ambiguity than the original headlines ever suggested. Whether that ambiguity amounts to reasonable doubt or simply the normal messiness of any large circumstantial case is something people who follow this story closely still argue about today. And it's part of why Melanie McGuire's name keeps resurfacing, more than 15 years after a jury in New Jersey decided her fate, in podcasts, in documentaries, and now, in stories exactly like this one. There's also a broader lesson buried in a case like this one about how differently a trial can read in the moment versus how it reads years later, once the initial media frenzy has faded, and researchers with no stake in the original verdict get a chance to comb back through the paperwork at their own pace. In 2007, this case was covered as a fairly straightforward story: a nurse, an affair, a husband cut into pieces and packed into luggage, a conviction that felt almost inevitable given the sheer volume of circumstantial detail stacked against her. It's only with the benefit of distance, a podcast built specifically to dig back through old evidence, and 2 academics with the time to actually request and review documentation most casual observers never see, that some of these smaller inconsistencies, the ballistics question, the untested trash bags, the unexplained animal hair, ever resurfaced publicly at all. Whether any of it would have changed the jury's original decision is impossible to know for certain. What's clear is that, for Melanie McGuire, sitting in a New Jersey prison with no parole eligibility until she's over 100 years old, that lingering uncertainty is effectively the only thing keeping any hope of a different outcome alive. It's also worth thinking about how a case like this one gets built inside a courtroom in the first place, because juries rarely get handed a single, undeniable piece of proof in cases without eyewitnesses or a confession. Instead, they're asked to weigh dozens of smaller facts together and decide whether, taken as a whole, those facts point clearly enough in one direction. A gun purchased 2 days before a disappearance, a prescription written on a colleague's pad, toll charges someone tried to erase, a car relocated by unknown hands. None of those facts, standing completely alone, would likely convict anyone of anything. Strung together into a single timeline, they read very differently, and that's precisely the kind of cumulative argument prosecutors are trained to build in cases exactly like this one, where the physical crime scene itself never actually turned up. That same cumulative logic, though, is exactly what defense teams and later reviewers tend to push back against hardest, arguing that a long list of suspicious circumstances isn't automatically the same thing as proof beyond a reasonable doubt, especially once individual links in that chain, like the ballistics comparison or the trash bag testing, turn out to be less airtight than they appeared at the original trial. That tension between a prosecution's cumulative circumstantial narrative and a defense's insistence on scrutinizing every individual link in that narrative separately sits at the heart of nearly every major circumstantial murder case. And Melanie McGuire's remains one of the clearest, most publicly debated examples of it, still active today. 2 decades after those 3 suitcases were pulled out of the Chesapeake Bay, the underlying facts haven't changed, but the level of scrutiny applied to them keeps shifting, which is exactly why this particular case refuses to fully settle into the past the way most convictions eventually do. There's one more piece of context worth leaving people with, and it has less to do with the forensic details and more to do with how differently the public tends to react to a female defendant accused of this kind of premeditated, physically demanding violence. Prosecutor Prezioso herself has commented on the disconnect between the person Melanie appeared to be on paper, a soft-spoken fertility nurse helping couples have children, and the crime she was accused of committing, arguing behind the scenes that the mismatch between appearance and accusation shouldn't count in a defendant's favor. Podcast host Amy Schlossberg made almost the identical observation from the opposite direction, suggesting that same mismatch, someone who simply didn't fit the profile people expect a killer to fit, may have quietly worked against Melanie during the original trial rather than for her. Both readings can't be fully correct at once, and that disagreement over how much a defendant's outward presentation should influence a jury's judgment is, in its own way, exactly the kind of unresolved question this entire case keeps circling back to, nearly 20 years after it first made headlines.